Guys, I'm LQ. This is the LQ Review. Thank you so much for joining me here on my YouTube channel. This is where I talk about all the geeky, nerdy stuff that I love to talk about: movies, video games, comic books, TV shows, and honestly, guys, what is more nerdy than the Tolkienverse? Maybe Star Trek, but the Tolkienverse is right up there. We're talking about The Hobbit, we're talking about Lord of the Rings, and we're talking about everything that comes in between. But right now, today, what I want to do is I want to rank the 6 live-action Lord of the Rings movies. That includes the 3 Hobbit movies, and that includes the 3 Lord of the Rings movies. So what I'm not including in this are the 3 animated films. There were 3 animated films that came out by Rankin Bass in the 70s, I believe. You had The Hobbit, you had The Lord of the Rings, and you had The Return of the King. All animated using that classic Rankin Bass style, all except for Lord of the Rings, which kind of featured a more human hybrid model of animation. No, we're not going to count those in here. We're just going to focus on the 6 live action directed by Peter Jackson. All right, I loved all 6 of them. The Lord of the Rings universe is just, it's one of my favorite franchises in all of film, right up there with Star Wars, and it just captures my imagination. To be completely honest with you, I have read The Hobbit, I have read the Lord of the Rings books, but the writing of J.R.R. Tolkien doesn't necessarily grab me. It was a bit of a labor getting through some of the books. The Hobbit was the easiest, but then we get into Lord of the Rings and it was a bit of a labor getting through them. I've read them, I got through them, but his writing didn't grab me. But the movies, not only did they grab me, but they captured my imagination. And I just love revisiting the Tolkienverse. And I can't wait until the Amazon original series comes out so we can go back to the Tolkienverse. Little disclaimer. The Hobbit movies are not as good as the Lord of the Rings movies. Not anybody, I'm sure there are some people who love the Hobbit movies, but I think most people are going to agree that the Hobbit movies are here, the Lord of the Rings movies are here. There's a big difference. But that doesn't mean, so I think lots of times what people do is they equate the Hobbit movies as being bad because they're comparing them to the Lord of the Rings movies. And that doesn't mean they're bad. The Hobbit movies are still very good. When I compare the Hobbit movies to most of the stuff that Hollywood spews out today, they are still superior. As a whole, they're just not quite as good as the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So that being said, you might have an idea on where things are going here. I'm going to try to keep things a little bit surprising, though. And let's start out with number 6. The worst movie, in my opinion, in all 6 movies is The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey. Now, this movie had a lot of fun tie-ins to the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Obviously, Gandalf plays a major role in The Hobbit, The Unexpected Journey. It begins with Frodo. You know, in a lot of the ways, this is Frodo's story. So it begins with Frodo, and I understand why Peter Jackson made the decision to bookend Frodo on all 6 movies, because it's really his story. You also had Gollum in this, and in my opinion, the stuff with Gollum is the best stuff in this movie. My big problem with this movie is that the entire movie is set up. Not only does it have to labor to set up the the Hobbit trilogy, it also does a lot of labor setting up the Lord of the Rings trilogy. This movie it's actually adequate that they call it The Unexpected Journey, because this whole movie is about starting the journey. And to that sense, there's not really an ending. They try to give you a bit of an ending with the White Orc, but there really isn't much of an ending. This is very open-ended in the sense that, yep, part 2 is coming. And the rest of it is just starting the journey. So, number 6 for me is The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey. Number 5 in the Lord of the Rings saga is The Hobbit, the Battle of the Five Armies. And it starts out great. It starts out great with Bard the Bowman taking out Smaug, but then it becomes a bit of a convoluted mess. There is a lot happening in this movie, especially when you get to the battle, and it can be very inside baseball to somebody who's not well versed in the Tolkien mythology. It could be very hard for somebody to follow, somebody to understand, and what the implications are for this as a whole. The battle itself, the Battle of the Five Armies, was a little bit too massive, and it felt, and this might be the problem, it felt bigger than the Battle of Pelennor Fields and Return of the King, but it felt infinitely less important. So it felt bigger than that Return of the King battle, but infinitely less important. And that's kind of where the problem was. I didn't feel any stakes in this. And I felt stakes for the dwarves. I felt the stakes for Thorin and his company. But I didn't feel any stakes for the Middle Earth as a whole. And that's where the problem was for me. It just felt too small to culminate the first trilogy. So, yeah, and it also felt too long. The Battle of the Five Armies was just too long, too much happening, too much crammed in, and it got very convoluted. That being said, there was some really good stuff. It was nice to see Legolas back in the Tolkien universe with the Battle of the Five Armies, and a lot of the character development for Bilbo was just exceptionally done. All right, so that's number 5, The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies. Number 4 is The Hobbit. It's The Hobbit, The Desolation of Smaug, and I really liked it. The middle Hobbit movie for me was by far the best one. Not only, and probably because it was the best one for me because it was about the journey, and it was about the journey coming to an end with Smaug. There was the beginning of the journey at the beginning of the movie. It wasn't technically the beginning of the journey, but we picked up where they left off at the end of the first Hobbit. You had the journey, you had the end, and then you had the climax. The climax was the face-off against Smaug. And I loved it. I loved Benedict Cumberbatch as the voice of Smaug. I loved... This was a good movie. Unfortunately, it was also a little bit long, a little bit drawn out. There's a lot of filler stuff put in there. But Desolation of Smaug was a lot of fun. And it really did a good job, again, of building the character of Bilbo Baggins, but also really establishing who Thorin Oakenshield is, and even giving Gandalf some more moments to shine. So, Desolation of Smaug was number 4 for me. Number 3 is Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. And this one kind of suffers from some of the same problems that The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey suffers from. This is really about setting things up, putting things in motion for the next chapter. And because of that, The Fellowship of the Ring suffers a little bit. But what it does infinitely better than An Unexpected Journey, is it sets things up in an interesting way, in a meaningful way, with more interesting characters. And even though it's still a long movie, it feels like it's much quicker putting those events into motion that's going to pay off in later movies. And we also have a beginning and an ending in this movie. We see the Fellowship begin. We also see the Fellowship break up at the end. So there's a bit of a climax there at the end where you can have an ending. Whereas I didn't feel like An Unexpected Journey really had a strong ending to it. Fellowship of the Ring, at the very least, had a strong ending where you can point to it and you can say, yep, that was the end, that was the climax. You had Boromir's death, and you had the Fellowship breaking up. That was the climax. And Fellowship of the Ring also has some iconic moments. Gandalf's death, Strider at excuse me, Strider fighting off the ring wraiths. I mean, definitely some great moments in this film, but it's not quite as good as the other two. So that's why it's number 3. Number two. Number 2 is one that a lot of people are going to disagree with, but number 2 for me is Lord of the Rings: Return of the King. Lord of the Rings: Return of the King was a phenomenal movie. But, there's a but here. But they cheated. They cheated. Alright? Once Aragorn arrives with the ghost, the battle is over. There was no way. They were invincible at that point. They were invincible. And yeah, the war still had to happen. They still had to, go to the Black Gates. Frodo and Sam still had to get the ring to the top of Mount Doom. But the big battle, the Battle of Pelennor Fields, ended on a cheat. Still some rousing moments. King Theoden, his rousing speech to lead the riders of Rohan into battle. I'm getting goosebumps right now thinking about it. And this movie had not one, but 2 rousing speeches, because when you have Aragorn giving his speech at the end, at the Black Gates, the kingdom of man will not fall on this day. Such a powerful moment that, this ragtag army, this last stand of mankind, surrounded by orcs on all sides, willing to lay down their lives just to give Frodo a chance to get to the top of Mount Doom. Such a phenomenal moment. But I do feel it's not as good as the movie that's at the number 1 spot, the Two Towers. And I feel that because it's not as tight of a movie as the Two Towers are. It's very long, it's very drawn out, and there's just a whole lot of different things happening in this movie. Whereas the Two Towers is a much tighter narrative. And everybody always talks about the endings of Return of the King, and it's true. It had like 500 different endings, and that kind of made it feel drawn out also. But at the flip side, I always felt like they earned those endings. They earned them. It still felt a little drawn out. Whereas the number 1 movie, Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers, did not feel drawn out. And that's why I think it's the best movie. Because it was a very tight movie. Even though it was long, the narrative was tight, it was easy to follow, and you saw character development on all the main characters. Did a great job of introducing new characters like Theoden, and it also ended on, in my opinion, on what is, in my opinion, the greatest battle ever filmed in live action. And that is the Battle of Helm's Deep. The Battle of Helm's Deep is the most rousing cinema, perhaps, that I've ever seen. The elves marching in, centuries ago, we had an alliance. We fought and died next to man. We're here to honor that alliance. It's like, oh, yeah, I love it, I love it, I love it. And then we actually see Theoden, King Theoden. We see him go from king to great king in the span of this movie. In the span of the Battle of Helm's Deep, we see him go from king to great king. We saw him go from man to great man when he makes that decision to ride out. To ride out, blow the horn, and ride out and meet their fates. And such a great moment when Gandalf rides in and the sun beats down, and such great imagery. Such great imagery. We also saw that same imagery in some ways in Return of the King. When the riders of Rohan showed up, you could literally see the sun coming with them. And the darkness was in the fields outside of Gondor. Oh, man. Gets me so pumped. The Two Towers is, in my opinion, by far the best Lord of the Rings movie, because it was just such a well-told story that culminated in such a fantastic moment for all of our heroes. The Two Towers is my favorite. So, to recap, number 6 is The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey. Number 5 is The Hobbit: The Battle of the Five Armies. Number 4 is The Hobbit: The Desolation of Smaug. Number 3 is Lord of the Rings: The Fellowship of the Ring. Number 2 is Lord of the Rings Return of the King. And number 1 is Lord of the Rings The Two Towers. What is your favorite Lord of the Rings movie? How would you rank them? There's only 6 movies to rank. How would you rank them? Let me know in the comments down below. I would love to hear your take on it. And guys, that's why I do this. I do this to engage people in conversation about the nerdy stuff that I love to talk about. So make sure you leave a comment and I will talk back and we'll have ourselves a little conversation about the Lord of the Rings. The 6 movies that are just so great. Make sure you subscribe to my channel. And until next time, we'll see you guys later.